Good evening. Welcome to the Bothell Planning Commission meeting for Wednesday, May 7th. The meeting will come to order, and we're joined this evening by members of the Landmark Preservation Board as well, who will be working with us on the initial review of the historic preservation element to the 2015 periodic plan. Are there any non-agenda public comments? Seeing none, we'll move to approval of previous meetings' minutes. So I'll entertain a motion for the approval of minutes of March 12th, and I'll note Sam was not in attendance at that meeting, and Eric, I know you were not there, so you can exclude yourself from voting on this. So the rest of us, though, were here, and so would someone either provide comment or a motion to approve those minutes?
I make a motion that we approve the minutes of the meeting for March 12th, 2014.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Let the record show that the approval of the minutes of March 12th was approved unanimously, with Sam not in attendance and Eric abstaining. For the minutes of March 19th, 2014, and during that meeting, Peter, myself, and Sam were absent, and so I'll abstain from voting, but I would entertain any comments or a motion to approve.
I move to approve the regular Planning Commission meeting minutes for March 19th.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Let the record show that the minutes approval for March 19th passed unanimously, with Peter and Sam absent and Steve abstaining because he was not in attendance. Is there any new business? Hearing none, we're going to go on to actually continue our public hearing on the 2015 periodic plan and code update. And for that, we'll turn it over to our staff member for this evening, and that's Gary Hassler. Gary?
Thank you, Steve. Good evening, Planning Commission and Landmark Preservation Board members. I have a brief presentation for you to introduce this item to the Planning Commission. I'm going to give you just a tiny bit of background, which you're all familiar with. The Landmark Board members have had this before, too. But just in case anyone's watching at home and seeing the periodic plan and code update for the first time, just a quick slide to summarize what we're doing. The Washington State Growth Management Act requires the periodic updating of local comprehensive plans and development regulations. In 2011, the state legislature established deadlines for the next periodic update. And in accordance with that schedule, our deadline for adoption of an updated plan and implementing regulations is June 30th, 2015. The primary purpose of the 2015 Periodic Plan and Code Update is to ensure that our local plan and regulations comply with all current requirements of the GMA. It's anticipated that the Plan and Code Update will comprise the bulk of the Planning Commission's work for the rest of this year and the early part of next year, and the bulk of the Council's land use items for the first half of 2015. So as you all know, you've been working through the major plan elements. Tonight we're looking at the historic preservation element. The Bothell Municipal Code in Title 11-18060 actually requires for the historic preservation element that the Planning Commission, Shorelines Board, which in this case is not applicable, and the Landmark Preservation Board collaborate in making recommendation to City Council, and Council takes final action. The Landmark Preservation Board is primarily responsible for implementing Title 22, the historic preservation regulations in the city. So they held a study session on the historic preservation element on February 25th and a public hearing on April 25th at their monthly meeting. And at the conclusion of the April 25th public hearing, the board adopted a preliminary recommendation to Council regarding the element. And then the purpose of this joint public hearing is to ensure that the Planning Commission and Landmark Preservation Board collaborate in making recommendation to Council as required by Title 11. So that's why we're here. Summarizing the proposed amendments to the historic preservation element, essentially they include update of the background information and data, which we've been doing with all the major plan elements, including removing references to the actual number of historic resources inventory structures, and I'll explain that just a little bit. The city keeps an electronic database of all structures within the city that are 50 years of age or older. And as you can imagine, structures become 50 years of age or older literally daily or weekly or monthly. So we keep a database of those, and then we use that database as a resource to identify structures that may have historic significance so that we can use that information in reviewing demolition permits and also for proposing structures to either the state, local, or national historic registers. So that inventory is literally just what it says. It's an inventory. It doesn't mean that a structure has significance. It's just a resource that we use so we know everything that's 50 years or older. The reason we removed references to the actual number of HRI structures in the element was that, as I just mentioned, something can become 50 years or older almost daily. So those numbers in the element become obsolete very fast, and after a year or two, they're way out of date. And because we only update the plan every 8 years, we decided that it didn't make sense to keep trying to reference the number of structures on that inventory. And in addition, the Landmark Board recommended strengthening language relating to the historic resources inventory, and you'll see that within that section in the element. There's a paragraph or so of red underlined text that's new. We're also recommending updating certain policies to be more compliant with provisions of state law, including the Regulatory Reform Act, and I can point that out as we go through. Updating some policies to reflect changes made to Title 22 regarding historic preservation in 2011. In 2011, the Landmark Preservation Board completely overhauled Title 22 regarding historic preservation and made a recommendation to Council, which was adopted by Council in 2011. So because those regulations have been fairly recently overhauled, we're not recommending any changes to Title 22 at this time, just to the element, the historic preservation element itself in the plan. Amendments to reflect that some initiatives have been completed. We've been doing that with some of the Planning Commission elements as well. If something has been completed, a policy has been completed, we're recommending that it now be removed because it's no longer applicable. And then amendments to figure HP1, which is the only figure in the historic preservation element, to show just historic register properties versus what we were calling concentrations of historic resources. Figure HP1 is in your packet, the proposal for the new figure HP1. So it shows all of the local, state, and national register properties within the city. Previously, we attempted to show clusters or concentrations of everything that was on the historic resources inventory. And as I mentioned with it becoming obsolete, it was the same with the map. Those clusters, for the most part, stayed the same, but new clusters arose as, for example, concentrations of mid-century American houses all turned 50 years of age within 5 or 10 years of each other. So the map became obsolete, as well as the references to the inventory within the element. And finally, the Landmark Board made a number of changes throughout the element just to improve readability, both in the element and in the figure itself. So our recommendation for this evening is to take public testimony, deliberate, and approve a preliminary recommendation to Council regarding the historic preservation element. And as with the rest of the plan update, following tonight, following a preliminary recommendation approval, Council would hear the Landmark Preservation Board Planning Commission recommendation in spring 2015 and adopt the plan update no later than June 30th of next year. That's my presentation. I would be glad to answer any questions you might have.
Thanks, Gary. So the way I'd like to kind of proceed at this point would be to open it up for those around the table here for any initial questions specifically to Gary's presentation. Let's hold off on kind of going page by page through the element or any of the language there. Let's do that in a minute. But just any questions on Gary's presentation from any of us sitting at the table? Okay, hearing none, we don't have, I don't believe, anyone in the room from a public hearing standpoint, but why don't we, for the record, clarify for any members of the public that may be listening in to how they could provide public comment or questions if they so desire.
Certainly, thank you. The city is maintaining a website related to the 2015 periodic plan and code update. You can find the website on the planning, community development and planning pages. There's a couple of links to the website. In addition, for anyone who may be listening, they can call us at 425-486-8152, ask for planning, and we'll be glad to explain to them how to get comments to us.
Great. Thanks, Gary. I think it's probably good to clarify that really that this is an ongoing public hearing, we're not really opening and closing it. It's just it's being maintained and open as we go through the periodic plan. So I just want the public, however they may be accessing this information, to know that. So at this point, I guess I would go back to those sitting around the table. I have a few questions, but before I launch into it, I would ask if there's any, now just not only on Gary's presentation, but on the material that we had provided to us, are there any comments or questions that you'd like to ask of him or of any of the staff?
Yeah, I've got a couple of just observations.
Edmund.
HP 5, page 5, section HP P-8 or dash P8. It's in reference to developmental applications which contain or are near lands which contain historical resources. That seems a little bit vague to me, and perhaps that ought to say something like that are adjacent to historical resources. And then on the next page, HP Action 1 refers to how often the historic survey and property inventory will be updated. Might be wise to have a time limit out there. It says, as resources allow, not to exceed 5 years or 6 years or 7 years or something of that nature.
If I could address that, the issue we have with updating the historic resources inventory is one of staffing, and it's a very significant issue. We have a landmark preservation consultant, a professional who is on contract for 10 hours a week. As part of that 10 hours a week, they staff the landmark board. They provide demolition review expertise for staff. They help us with development application review, and they work on special projects for the landmark board as well. So in the time they have left over, they attempt to keep the resources inventory updated. We changed the language from at least every 5 years to as resources allow, very deliberately for that reason. I don't know if Davina wants to add anything, but that was very deliberate to leave it as open-ended for us as possible, even though it may sound a little vague.
Well, does it need to be updated at least every 10 years?
There is no set state requirement for how many years, how often it has to be updated.
Okay.
It's sort of a rolling, ongoing thing because, as I said, structures become 50 years or older all the time.
Right.
But there is no specific state requirement for 5 years or 10 years or 8 years.
Okay, makes sense. Thanks.
Any other questions for Gary at this point from the rest of the table? So I had a few, and when I'm done, again, I'll open it up once more to the folks here. And that is, first of all, I want to just make sure I understood. There's kind of two lists, really. There's the historic resources. This is this list of every structure in the planning area that hits that 50-year threshold or older.
Yes, correct.
And can you give me an approximate number of structures that are on that list?
Approximate it's in the thousands.
Okay.
And I believe it's between, if my memory serves correct, it's between 2,000 and 4,000.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of structures.
Yeah. I mean, given the city of Bothel's age, that doesn't really surprise me.
Correct. And now the mid-century modern structures are coming 50 years of age.
That's right.
And that's a huge number, which is one of the reasons we've had difficulties keeping the inventory as bang up to date as we can.
Yeah. Bothell had a lot of growth 50
Yes,
years ago.
in the 50s,
in the what would be,
40s,
I guess, the
50s
early,
particularly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have that list.
Yes.
And then there is the second list is this one that you provided us that really is kind of described in this map. Is that right?
Correct. Those are actual registered properties.
So this is like a subset of,
Yes, it is.
of the resources inventory, which is, this is now, these, and it said there's 22 of them that have elevated their way to being registered in some way, either
Correct.
national, state, or local.
That's correct.
Okay.
So all of those structures are also on the inventory.
Okay.
And at some point, someone, usually the Landmark Board, determined that they had enough historical significance that they were worth proposing to the council to place on a register,
Okay.
either the local, state, or national. As you can see, some of them are on just the local, some are on just the state and national. There are various combinations depending on the historic significance of the structure and how it qualified for one or more of those registers.
Okay. And that is really one of the main responsibilities of the Landmark Board, is to decide, are there other structures that could be either elevated onto this list, or I did notice that there's also language with regards to other ways of maybe the building could be moved to another site
Yes,
before it's just demolished.
that's correct. There's a hierarchy that you'll see in the regulations in particular. And you're correct that the city is what's known as a certified local government under state law.
Okay.
That carries certain responsibilities towards historic preservation with it. And actually, we're one of the few cities of our size that is a CLG.
Okay.
Part of those certified local government responsibilities is nominating local structures to the registers.
Okay.
We try to do one a year, although depending on the board's workload and staff resources, board resources, we don't always manage one a year. But we've had years where we put a couple on. That's the goal.
Okay. Well, let me just say from a kind of a strategic standpoint of what I think we're trying to do here with the plan update, which is a strategic document, I really support the idea of not having this specific information on the inventory in it, and I don't think that that is particularly helpful, and I'm glad it's maintained. I'm glad we've got it. We can get it if we need it. So I'm very supportive of the kind of the strategy here, both to support the Growth Management Act, what the city itself wants to accomplish, and as well as just the realities of staff resources. So I just kind of wanted to lend my 2 cents there to the overall language that you've, the changes that you've provided. I had a couple of just very detailed questions, and I just counted them. I'm probably wrong, but I'll just ask. So on HP 3, the second paragraph, where we have some specific numbers here, we're saying there's a total of 22 properties that are on this this register, and I counted on the map, and I did count the 22, but then it said we have let's see, we have it was 9 on the national. Am I right? And I could only count 8. So just correct me, where am I missing it? I just counted up the ends on the map and only counted 8.
Well, without actually going through the register list itself, I'm not sure I'd be able to tell you offhand, but I
Let's just have it right.
can certainly double check
So
it.
let's just
And
double check that, so that our number on the map as well as the language in our plan is
Match.
consistent.
yeah,
I also, and maybe just check all of them.
yep.
I saw one other one that appeared to be off as well. It appeared to me that, let's see, it said 14 on the local register, and I actually counted 16. So I just say just go through that paragraph and just double check those numbers so that we're
We'll do that.
consistent there. The only other kind of comment that I would add would be, this would be on HP 7. And on that, where the first note there with the February 28th, 2014 annexation, basically what you, in the action underneath that, you're suggesting keeping this interlocal agreement with Snohomish County, but not with King, and it's because we've
know.
gone ahead and annexed most of our, or if not all of our potential King car.
That's correct.
As I was reading for it, and we want the readability of our plan to flow, I was like, why would we keep one for Snohomish and not for King? But then I saw the note. Is there a way we can include that as a footnote or in some way as we're going through it, just so that
So the reader is aware.
the reader is aware that,
Yeah.
okay, we're continuing the interlocal agreement with Snohomish County, but not with King, and here's the reason why.
That's a great idea. I'm sure we can come up
I don't know
with
if there's a
some.
footnote or something.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
So, that's all I had. So, Any further comments or questions for staff at this point?
Steve, I do have one comment.
Oh, just make sure your mic's on.
Okay. Going back to that hierarchy you were talking about, Gary,
Yes.
is there direction or is there a kind of a criteria for determining what an owner would have to do? I mean, does the city, in other words, have the right to tell an owner, you will redesign this project to avoid impacting this building, or?
If a structure is actually on the local, state, or national register, there are some guidelines that have to be followed. For national register properties, there are federal standards that are they're called the Secretary of the Interior's Standards for Rehabilitation that have to be followed. When the owner agrees to place their property on the register, they sign a management contract where they agree to that. And it takes permission of the owner to put a property on the register. Actually, I'll backtrack a little bit. Theoretically, a property could be placed by council on the register without the owner's permission, but I think that's unlikely to happen. You pretty much want to have the owner's permission to do that. Otherwise, they're going to do what they want to do anyway. On the local register, Title 22, our historic preservation regulations, actually have a fair bit of language in there about what can happen if an owner wants to modify the local register property. So those regulations have to be followed. And again, they enter into that management contract when they agree to register the property, so that's where Title 22 kicks in.
So if a property's not registered, but it's on the inventory, it's just acknowledged that there's a potential there when an application comes in or something, and then?
That's a really good question, Eric. We occasionally do get applications particularly for demolition permits, for structures that may have some historic significance and may have enough significance that we would recommend putting them on the local, state, or national register. In fact, we had an example recently of a house called the Garner Residence that sits on Ross Road, just above the UW campus. You might remember it's a long, sweeping lawn up to a pretty little white house. A developer had purchased that property, including the residence, and wanted to subdivide it, and was proposing to simply demolish the property. Essentially, staff worked with him over a long period of time and negotiated, and that's what it was. It was a negotiation because the property wasn't yet on a register. Negotiated to the point where the developer agreed to retain the structure on site and to put it on one of the back lots and rehabilitate it and sell it as a single-family residence. So that's happening now. We've been successful doing that, surprisingly, on a surprisingly large number of occurrences. But ultimately, if a property is not on the register and those negotiations don't work, the property probably gets demolished. We've just been very successful at not having it come to that most times.
Thank you.
I think that's a really important point that Commissioner Clark brought up, and that is this idea of, in the world of real estate, we'd call it a material fact, but just this very key piece of information that buyer needs to know with regards to a property. Yes. And whose responsibility it is. Now, we would assume that the seller would inform the buyer of that, but that's not always going to be the case. So if there is a way that the city, during the application process, if it's for a construction permit or something like that,
I should mention, too, that that's where that hierarchy comes in. The first preference in the hierarchy is to keep the structure intact and in situ. If we can't do that, then the hierarchy goes down a list, and the next preference is to move it on site, move it off site, salvage as much architectural detail as possible from the structure, and finally the last option is demolition. Okay. So that's what we do in those negotiations, is try to work through each of those options. And we require a pretty detailed analysis from the developer that to tell us if you're going to recommend, if you want to demolish the structure, you've got to tell us why you can't do all these other things first. And it's got to be more than just, well, we don't want to move it. So it can become a fairly involved process, and as I say, we've been successful with those negotiations in the past. Everyone's familiar with the Montevilla farmhouse, I think, out in the Montevilla Business Park, that went through the same process. It was originally proposed for demolition.
Well, and for example, Ricketts, we went through some
Yes.
of the landmark board and picked out pictures and such. that people save and salvage for, who knows, maybe Anderson,
Yeah.
maybe McMiniman.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
That we have that history there, and I know a lot of our citizens really valued that building. I think there were a lot of bricks from that building, and I don't know where they all ended up, but yeah.
Well, we salvaged a lot of bricks from the Red Brick Road.
Yeah,
When
yeah.
portions of that had to be removed. We have piles of bricks up at the public workshop. So the board and staff worked very hard to do that.
Good. Glad to hear
They
that.
did a great job with Garner because the public actually came to us and said, whoa,
Yeah.
this is happening. Do you realize this is happening? And
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that.
they did
Yeah.
a great job.
Can I throw in one more thing, Steve?
Sure.
So the hierarchy, I just want to make sure I'm clear on this, is applies to either structures that are already on the historic register or the staff realizes upon maybe an application or something that this could be.
Yes, that's
But
correct.
if is there a criteria for determining what that could be is? I mean, there's a lot of houses over 50 years old that I wouldn't say are warranted to be saved, but is there a point where staff says, yeah, it's over 50 years old, but
Yes.
it's a, split level that.
There are.
Okay, so.
There are. Title 22 actually contains some criteria for what constitutes a local register property, and then the state and feds have criteria for what constitutes a state or national register property. So it's not just staff saying, yeah, we think this one should be on.
But if staff determines that it's not, though, then this hierarchy doesn't even apply?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. In that case, we usually require full photo documentation of the structure prior to demolition, and at that point, if we're satisfied with the documentation and the report that we've received, we'll issue a demolition permit.
Okay. Thank you.
So every structure that is on the inventory and comes in for a demolition permit goes at least through that process.
Any other questions, comments for staff? Hearing none, I think from a process standpoint, I'd be interested in kind of your recommendation. Like as I said, this is really an ongoing public
Yeah.
hearing. We do want to have, allow a period, even though the public was not here today, to potentially provide feedback, questions to staff. I don't know what exact period of time, whether it's 2 weeks or...
Well,
3
our
weeks or
recommendation would be, as you've been doing with the elements you've worked through so far, you would have in this case, we would have a preliminary recommendation from both the Landmark Preservation Board and the Planning Commission, just as you've come up with preliminary recommendations on the elements you've worked through so far. So that document would be there as a preliminary recommendation, and it would still be able to, during the time that you're working through elements and sub-area plans and then council's working through everything, someone could still make comments and provide input, and changes could be made right up until the adoption of the plan.
Okay.
So we would like, if it works for both the Landmark Board and Planning Commission, to have you make a motion to preliminarily approve the historic preservation element, and then, as we've been doing, bring you that preliminary recommendation document as an FYI in your next packet.
Okay. Well, then I would, at this point, ask if there would be a motion provided, and I won't go ahead and articulate it, but I might ask one of you to go ahead and articulate a motion.
I make a motion that we preliminarily approve the historic preservation element.
Do I hear a second or any amendment to that motion
Do
or
we need
discussion
to,
on it?
Set on a date for when to continue that conversation? Or is that?
No, you don't, because at this point, we'll just bring you that document back as an FYI, as we've been doing with the other
Yeah, I
preliminary
think actually
approval.
we're actually really approving it right now, based on the language that was provided to us, that the work that the Preservation Board has already done, the staff has done, our comments tonight. We are depending on staff to incorporate our feedback, as well as any feedback that they're going to get from the public.
Correct.
So I think as far as this evening is concerned, we're going to go ahead and just preliminary approve that.
Correct. With the caveat that you will see all of those preliminary approved documents again
Yep.
before we send the whole package off to council.
So,
I'll second that motion then.
all right, the motion has been offered and second. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Let the record show that that motion approved unanimously to preliminarily approve the language that, with our comments and any feedback you might get from the public.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. At this point, I'll certainly let the Landmark Preservation Board members excuse themselves if they'd like to. You're welcome to stay if you want, but you probably have evening activities. It was great to have you join our meeting.
Nice to meet you.
Great to meet up both of you. So thanks very much for coming.
Thanks, guys.
So at this point, we are, if we can have we're now in the dark. But did we lose all our lights, Bill?
You want some more back?
Well, maybe not. Well, yeah. All right, let's go with this. We're going to go forward with the next half of our, the second half of our agenda, which is a continued second review of the community services element. And I might add, I really appreciate the support of the plan of the commission staff. I know I was the one who kind of spoke up to champion maybe another way of kind of handling the community services element. And so at this point, I'll turn it over to Bill for his presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve, and good evening, Commission members. This will be the third presentation some of you have received on this element. So I'll go through fairly quickly. The community services element is not a required element under GMA. Nor is it a listed optional element under the Growth Management Act, and the GMA provides no goals or other direction concerning community services. But we included a community services element in the original comp plan because there was the desire back then to make the plan inclusive of all aspects of community life, and as we've discussed before, we had a much bigger staff, and so we anticipated being able to maintain a comprehensive plan that included more elements than the Growth Management Act required. Since then, our staff has dwindled, and we've had to focus on a lot of other things. So one of the emphases of this plan update is streamlining the plan and getting back kind of to basics. Also back in 1994, when the council adopted the original Imagine Bothell plan, the city owned a building that had a human service in it, the multi-service center building. That building was north of the Dawson building where I work, and that's now gone. And also back then, city human services funding decisions were pretty much on an ad hoc basis, and it's been systemized since then. So the staff's original proposal was to eliminate this element for some of the reasons I just discussed on the last slide, but with one exception, and the exception had to do with some fitness-related policies that are in the community services element, and that's because there was an amendment to the Growth Management Act a couple of years ago that required the inclusion in the land use element of planning approaches that increase physical activity. So to comply with the GMA, staff proposed to save a couple of policies and a couple of implementing actions and move them to land use. All right, so that was the proposal that went to the Commission on March 12. The Commission supported the elimination of community services as a standalone element, but the Commission saw some merit in retaining certain selected goals, policies, and actions. And so at that meeting, Commissioner Booth volunteered to identify texts that he felt warranted retention, then to work with staff, and then come back with a proposal to the Commission at a future meeting. And so Steve and I did that over the course of a couple of weeks and came back to the April 9 meeting with a proposal. And the proposal was to retain certain goals, policies, and actions that pertained to those human services categories in which the city could have some actual influence, not just aspirational statements that the city couldn't really control. The second part of the proposal was to relocate those retained goals, policies, and actions to the housing element, and then to retitle that element Housing and Human Services, which is a pretty common pairing in larger cities that have the kinds of resources to be able to actually offer housing programs. And so I had to pull out all the tricks in the track changes book, and I showed those goals, policies, and actions proposed to be relocated in highlight. Still shown as strike through because that entire element is going to go away, but the text to be retained is highlighted. So that on April 9th, Commissioner Booth, who had expressed an interest in this, a particular interest in this element, was not in attendance, and so Peter Bacciuello asked if the rest of the commission would agree to continue discussion to April 30th, and so the commission did so. There wasn't really much discussion of the item at all at the April 9 meeting. And then on April 16, the commissioners were looking ahead at their schedules for April 30 and realized that it was Commissioner Booth and I think some others would not be able to attend that meeting. And so on April 16th, the continued discussion of the community services element was further continued to tonight. The version in your packet tonight is identical to the one you had in your April 9 packet, except for the header. Staff's recommendation is that the Commission accept public testimony, deliberate, and then preliminarily approve the deletion of the community services element, but with the retention and relocation of certain sections to the retitled Housing and Human Services element as it's proposed in your packet, or with any additional revisions you care to make tonight. That concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to try to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Bill. So I will kick this off knowing that I'm been mentioned by name as one who was working on this with the staff and wanting us to take kind of another look at whether we actually just eliminated this from our plan completely. And let me just say I very much appreciate both the support of my fellow commission members as well as staff to do this. So thank you very much. I recognize that we have a very busy calendar. We have to keep moving. And so I just wanted to express my appreciation to each of you for that. I've gone through page by page in the revised element that staff has provided, and I can tell you I'm very supportive of both the language retained as well as some of the new language. I appreciated very much. One of my points was that I felt, first of all, given that we're talking a significant line item in our city's budget for community services, that having at least some guidance from the strategic plan was appropriate. Secondly, I just thought it was, even though not required by the Growth Management Act, that it was in keeping with what I believe to be Bothel's values, that in some way our people need to know that our city has resources and there's ways for them to access them. So I really just think the language both, and I do not need to go page by page. I've done that. But I think, again, the language that's been retained, that staff has recommended, as well as some of the new language that's been crafted, certainly fits what I would have liked to have seen. And placing it in the housing element is absolutely fine from my standpoint. So those are my comments. I don't have a whole lot more to add, and I mean, I would be ready to go ahead and make this kind of preliminary approval motion that staff has described. Are there any comments from any of the other commission members? Or
I do. I have one. I just reading HSP 1, the duty. I just with the word duty, and I was just wondering
what page are you on?
page
CS1?
CS1, yeah.
Okay.
HS-P1.
Wait, they all say CS1.
Yeah, there's a lot of CS1. Okay,
Yeah,
hold on.
That's a byproduct of the strikeout function of track change. Yeah.
I guess it's
Everything's CS1.
Everything
Right.
reverts to
the
page
first
one.
line.
Okay.
So this is the big highlighted one.
The big highlighted one. And that's new.
That is new. That was at the request of the commission.
And I don't remember talking about the word duty, and I just want to make sure that everybody feels comfortable with that word. You don't see that very often I haven't seen that in any of our documents before. And it talks about it's probably appropriate because it's a word that, I looked it up because I wanted to make sure I understood the definition of it. Moral duty, it talks about moral and financial, so it fits here, but we don't see that very often. And it, when you're committing, and there are funds there, and I'm not privy, not because they're not there, it's just because I haven't looked at the actual funding, those amounts, those dollars, but that's a strong statement.
Yeah.
So,
Let me just comment on that. I really, I'm glad you brought that up, and I think you're right. I think the word duty could be misconstrued, and that certainly what I wanted to see here was the responsibility not be on the tax dollar, but on private charitable resources, but that there was a role. I guess I'm more comfortable with it is there is a role for the city and the city's resources, where they're even talking about, and the two things that kept in my mind was the city's website and the city employees that are in touch with our citizens. And I want them to be able to, both our website and any other communication tools, to be able to direct our citizens towards resources that are available to them. And so that's what I meant, but to kind of say that the city has its duty to assist, you're right, it could lead to a lot of.
I just read it. The duties took out. I looked it up. I wanted to make sure I understood the context. I was just making sure that everybody, it's because it's a new, it's our preamble, it's our first sentence. Hey, this is what we're saying. Hey, it's our duty here. And I just want to make sure that we understand what we're doing. And I didn't want to misconstrue, I think, like you said, it could be misconstrued, but with the way you spoke about it, I'm comfortable with it, okay? But I just want to make sure that that's the way everybody else reads it.
Yeah, I guess I would second Commissioner Gastineau's highlighting of that, and I don't know if we want to work out language on that right now.
I don't want to. I just haven't seen that word in a document before, and we don't do a lot of stuff with in Planning Commission. We don't do a lot of stuff with we run into this not very often. I'm more used on the land use, and this is something that's kind of outside of my expertise. And I saw that word. And
So I guess if we're not going to craft language right now, but I'm more comfortable with it. It is the role of the city to support and inform, perhaps.
we have resources. We have resources, and they have committed them in the past, and so they're there. But
Yeah.
I just
Any other comment?
Yeah, I agree with Pat on that. I would be perfectly happy to live in a world where we've got a lot of great nonprofits, a lot of great churches that take tremendous pride in addressing these. I'd be happy to live in a world where those organizations stepped up and we're helping these vulnerable citizens, and particularly when it comes to just where the city's focus is. Obviously, the city wants to cooperate with that, and the city wants to, see our vulnerable citizens helped. The wording, I agree with your interpretation, Steve. My concern would just be it's sufficiently ambiguous that it may be easy for other people to interpret it differently. Duty's a little bit ambiguous, and most vulnerable citizens is a kind of ambiguous phrase. It kind of gives me flashbacks to when we were talking about climate change, and we had some very ambiguous phrasing going through there. So the ambiguity makes me a little nervous, but if I knew that everyone was going to interpret it the way that you had described, I'd feel a lot better about it.
Any other comments or questions from any of the other commissioners? Yeah, Christopher Cape.
One quick comment. Same section. So how does this play out? The following sentence: the city will administer general fund allocations to those human service agencies which demonstrate the ability to meet Bothell residents' human services. I know we need some sort of qualifier that not every organization is going to get city funding, but I guess what's the hierarchy, or how do they come to the city and how do they get funded?
There's staff and a committee of council who review requests for funding from human services agencies, and it's true that not everyone gets funded. But this provides criteria that staff and that committee can apply to the requests to prioritize them. It's as simple as that.
It just seems, I don't know, it seems like if you had a stack of people applying, it'd be hard to quantify, the degree of effectiveness, the efficiency, preservation of dignity. I mean, I'm sure most of the human service organizations in Bothell have some of those elements, so I was just curious.
Oh, they
That
do.
would be-
They do indeed. But efficiency is trackable. It's one of the measures is how much of your of that agency's budget goes towards administration and how much goes towards actual provision of service to the citizens who are being served. So, I mean, that's just one indicator. I suppose there are others as well. There's no question that this is comp plan level language. This really wasn't intended to be down in the weeds, precise, specific language, but it is appropriate for a comprehensive plan. And to some people might feel strongly that it's the duty, it's a core responsibility of the city to do this. Others might not feel comfortable with that. So this is your recommendation. It's up to you to craft or recommend the language that you think conveys the city's principles and stance in this regard. If duty feels too strong, use responsibility.
Steve.
Commissioner Gastineau.
Yeah, just like that. And I brought that up because I wanted to make sure. And then as we listen to the testimony among us or talk among and reading more and understanding there is a hierarchy, I'm comfortable with it. I really am.
Okay. All right. I do appreciate you bringing it up. I think it's important, and we have to be careful with these strategic plans. I've certainly seen that in other areas where we want to reduce the potential for mischief or misconstruing intent and heading down the wrong way. But you're hearing what you just heard with regards to a hierarchy and kind of there is a method to how the city allocates funds.
And to me, I don't know the proper word. It's not softened, but yeah, it's not in context. If you just read duty and then haven't read the rest of it, and maybe I jumped the gun a little bit. And I read it again and read it again. Listened to Bill's testimony, heard your explanation. A lot more comfortable.
Okay. Thank you. Well, I don't know if there might, again, I don't know if we want to really spend a whole lot more time working on this, but I don't know if you and I want to make one more pass at this, or at this point, do we want to kind of say this is something we at least felt comfortable with, and the city council certainly is going to review this, and I welcome that. I actually welcome the city council weighing in on this as well.
Yeah.
Well, you yourselves will get another chance too when we
Yeah.
do the integration
Exactly.
review.
If we have something, so I think
next
I'm ready
February or
for that
so.
one.
So then, why don't we go ahead, unless
I just had one question. Are we going to see this language that's being pulled from this and put into the other?
Yes.
We'll see that in that format, so we'll have another opportunity. Because I think it's worthwhile to see this stuff actually incorporated into a document to make sure it flows and that
Yeah.
kind of thing.
No, thanks, Eric. It will. I think the housing element, what will be the housing and human services element, is scheduled to come to you in July, I think. June or July.
Okay.
Yeah. And these relocated policies will appear there. But having said that, and I think I said this in one of the early notes, they may not appear verbatim because it is a matter of context. They need to read correctly in the other element. So there may be some tweaking of words here and there, but we'll endeavor to retain the meaning and the intent of these.
Okay.
Well, I think that those were some really good comments. Are there any comments on any of the other parts of the element that we would want to provide at this point? Hearing none, then I think we should go ahead and provide a motion. And if one of the commissioners would like to kind of pretty well take a look at the language that's up on our screen now and provide a motion for us that we can at least move forward with this, let's go forward and do that.
Yeah, I'll move that we preliminarily approve the deletion of the community service element with retention on relocation of the certain sections of the retitled housing and human services element as proposed, or with any future revisions requested. Seeing none of those, there are no revisions requested, so we'll approve it as is.
Yep.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? Let the record show that this motion passed unanimously. Right. Okay. Moving on to the next part of our agenda, there's no study session, hearing no old business. Any reports from staff?
Was everyone here when you decided when to hold your elections?
Well, we were having a brief discussion of that before we actually started our meeting. But we will plan on doing that, I think, on the 21st. And I'll speak with Commissioner Bacciuello. He will be here. I think Commissioner Stahl won't be, but I think the rest of us
That's
will
correct.
be. So we will hold our elections on that day, on May 21st. Any other reports from staff, questions or comments? Hearing none. Reports from members. The only thing that I will put forward is just a reminder that we do have a meeting next week and on the 21st. At this point, we do not have a meeting on the 28th. So for 2 more weeks here in May, we will have meetings. At this point, motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
All in favor?
Aye.
Hi.
Meeting is adjourned.